And now I wanted to quickly go back on that topic of confetti syndrome.
Yes.
So this is always a matter of personal taste, but weighing the actual ramifications of not just things like memory, but more importantly, communicating to the player and how you're affecting gameplay. And a suggestion to artists that are doing actual game graphics or mock-ups, keep this in mind. Background elements that are there purely for being pretty and for setting the mood and atmosphere, what it should not do is distract the player. And they made an incredibly bold decision with the fill pattern of those background hills or bushes that is not only sharp angles and bright contrasting vivid green, but it is also a repeating pattern that is blatantly repeating. Nothing grabs your attention more than something that's supposed to be the least important thing from a gameplay point. And that is dangerous to do. It is not necessarily wrong to do. This team, they did amazing work. Mario 3 in every way is a brilliant game. However, boy did they have cojones for making this decision. In this screenshot, Mario is both in his Tanuki suit, Tanuki boot, we'll just call it that. But you'll see, like especially, you've already got that green, and it's a very distracting pattern, and then you've got him there. Mario almost disappears.
Well, also, when they did Luigi, it was just a recolored Mario. So, like, if
Exactly.
you were Luigi in that green boot,
all green,
and you got in front of that, you know.
And so it's bad enough you're going to have to allow for that often on the 8-bit Nintendo, because you've got a total of something like 50 possible colors you can use, and then there's only like something in the area of 26 maximum total colors you could have. So you're going to end up frequently with characters or enemies that have to end up in front of the same color as a color that's in them. However, when you make it very high contrast and a repeating pattern, you're fighting against what, in my opinion, should be top priority: communication to the player. For whatever reason, maybe they really liked it, maybe they just really felt that that repeating pattern harkened back to more of the aesthetic Super Mario 1 and 2. I don't know, but that's irrelevant. The game is still gorgeous, but my point is, this was the most bold and, in my opinion, questionable decision, just because it really becomes very distracting. And then the other thing is, you have these round hills or bushes, which should be inherently a soft thing, like every other bush they draw, yet now they're putting this incredibly abstracted, hard, angular pattern. It brings up questions. I don't mean questionable like they were idiots or whatever. I'm just saying it makes me wonder, why was this so important to them that they were willing to have it look so distracting to the player? Let me just quickly cover it. Like, it's important when you make such a decision, even if you really like it, something should go off in your head, a little alarm that says, I like it, but here are the ramifications. It does make the screen more distracting, and it does make it harder to read if there's an enemy in there, especially if it's green too, or Luigi is there. It makes it harder to see Luigi. And what's more important to me? You have to make that judgment call as the art director of the game. So you should always be willing, especially if you have the time, to try the other options, right? Go into filled rectangle mode, and now I can just quickly make it all the solid dark green. And you could see instantaneously, like you might go, oh, but that looks too simple. Well, it doesn't look colorful enough. But now you'll see when I grab Mario in his green boot, now we have beautiful readability, just as readable as against the sky. And then the other thing, once we get to that point, we could try also a repeating pattern, but make it something that makes a lot more sense in general, something like these sorts of wavy lines that did actually become a typical Mario aesthetic in later games. So, like, this might be too thick, and this, you know, this is just a really rough idea or suggestion, but you could make a repeating tile pattern that has this sort of thing going on. And then fill your...
Yeah, and it would have kept the curviness or smoothness of the hills themselves.
Another thing could have been, well, maybe we'll just use the light green and just add some little highlights to the tops of the hills. Something sort of like this. you know what I mean, and taper it down. So there are a lot of different things to try that could have kept it, and you could cheat or do stuff like that depending on how many tiles you had to spare. But there were other potential patterns, or just using a solid color, that would have kept the readability at 100% and kept it at a softer aesthetic that maybe would have made more sense. When all of the other bushes in your game look like bushes, it's worth considering.
It's worth noting, if you look at all of these screens, even the overworld map of all things, they have the same HUD and it's got the same colors throughout everything. And it's worth noting here that in some of the levels, they actually make use of this palette that they've reserved for the HUD to draw the sky and the clouds and things like that.
Right.
But in this particular level, it's noted that they're not doing that. I mean, they're actually limiting to what colors they're using on the level itself.
So in other words, we know there are 4 total 3-color palettes, basically 3 color plus the background color for the tiles. So any tile on screen has to use any of those 4 palettes. So you're already very limited, and as we mentioned, sometimes you need to double up on one color being used by multiple palettes if you need that color to be used in different tiles. So that's another limitation. And then if you want your HUD to stay cohesive throughout the game, to keep the same color scheme, now you need to reserve one of the entire 4-color palettes at least for your HUD, which is what they did here. You can still use it in your environment graphics, and they do in some levels, but that's another limitation to keep in mind. Their other option would have been to change, like let's say you had a very different looking level and you wanted to be able to use all 4 background tile palettes. You would need to change the color palette of the HUD palette in a way that it still worked for the HUD, but still introduce those new colors to use in this new environment. But obviously that would mean the HUD would change. Suddenly the HUD might be a tan or brownish tint or a greenish tint. So you would be trading the overall visual quality of being able to add more color variety to your backgrounds in between each level, but there would be a massive price to pay, which would be your HUD would not be cohesive and would not look the same no matter what the level was. And that's a really big price to pay. The critical stuff that is constantly giving you information, you don't want that to change how it looks. You want that comfort of familiarity as much as possible. So the designers of this game obviously decided it was way more important to have the HUD consistent across the entire game than it was to have that potential extra flexibility of being able to change more colors in between each different environment.
You see, if you scroll up a little bit, you see that cloud there. That is drawn with the HUD palette, but it's still got the sky color. Remember, the sky color is the 0 color.
Right, the
shared color for all of the palettes. So the HUD specifically, if you notice, it's always just got the 3 colors.
Right.
It's not using whatever background color that they're using for the sky, because that's going to be switched out every level or different worlds,
Right.
So.
And you can see it uses the same frame as the HUD and the same tile palette. So again, you want that consistency of any user interface thing that's going to be repeatedly there to give the player information. You want that to stay cohesive and the same as much as possible. If you need to make a decision that's going to make the UI look different at any part in the game, give that decision a lot of weight. That's a big deal. It can work and you can be creative, but just be careful and keep in mind back in the 8-bit Nintendo days, they did not have that kind of memory and that many palettes available to go crazy like that. This is the kind of information that it was critical for pixel artists in the day to understand. And to be a professional pixel artist, especially in a AAA title, you had to not just understand these limits. You had to relish working within these limits and trying to figure out the ways to hide these limits or just make beautiful stuff happen within these limitations. And Nintendo was one of the studios that just always had that love and passion, which was why they made some of the most iconic and beloved games that survived right past the 8-bit and 16-bit era into the modern era. If you have this idea that you think is really cool, but it really goes against one or more of these what were concrete rules for the aesthetic of the entire franchise, you should weigh that very heavily Is that really such a cool idea that it's more important, that it's worth breaking your own aesthetic rule? Because even though like non-artists and people that don't understand how these decisions are made, they will feel the end result of those decisions.
Yep.
If you're changing the color of your HUD per level so you have those colors, they will feel the impact of that decision. They will feel that the game is a little lower quality or a little less comfortable to them than it otherwise would have been if you had made that different decision of making sure that HUD stays the same across every level.
Yeah, and plus it would also just affect the readability of the HUD per level. You know,
exactly.
you might have a slightly darker colors or different values there,
Right.
and the gameplay might get altered a little bit. You know, and these tile rip don't necessarily do it justice in terms of showing off the limitations of the palettes, because they're all just kind of crammed in here from different levels and things. But they do give you a good example of like, oh, you know, the pipes there, for example,
Right.
they're all the same tiles on the cartridge. They're just swapping out the palette
changing
and
the
draw them
colors,
in
right.
different levels. That gives you an example of how they can save space, you know, and they
Right.
were doing that constantly in these old games,
Right.
whether you realized it or not, you know.
Yep. In fact, little bit of trivia, in Mario 1 at least, Super Mario Brothers, the same tiles were used to create the bushes. They made the tile use a green palette, and those same tiles made the clouds. So
yeah.
that's another great example. And look, by the way, speaking of that bushes tile, look, somewhere else in the game they did use a plain solid color like I had demonstrated.
Yep.
So it was a really specific conscious decision in those particular levels to have that very specific aesthetic despite it being a distraction. Thanks very much for watching, and Corey, thanks very much. I couldn't ask for a better co-host for this type of video for sure. So
No problem. Much appreciated.
All right. Again, thanks everyone for watching, and I will stop the video now.
If you enjoy our content and want to keep up to date on our games, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you want to support our projects, consider becoming a patron. The link's in the description, and we'll see you soon.